Alright, yeah, welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week we're going to be taking a look at Rohit War's Red Deck wins for our subscriber series. So this is the first place winner to our subscriber tournament actually. But I was asked to add some Kaladesh cards in, so I figured since I was updating it we might as well make it into a full series. So Red Deck wins is an aggressive red deck that tries to be as aggressive as humanly possible so that your opponent can't really do anything about it. So we play a lot of 1-drops and a lot of hasty creatures and a lot of things that get really big and out of hand quite quickly. So if we start at the bottom of the curve, we've got Goblin Glory Chaser. So for 1 red we get a 1/1 with Renown 1. So whenever it deals combat damage to a player, if it's not renowned then you get to put a 1/1 counter on it. And as long as it is renowned then you get Menace as well. So if we get this guy down on turn 1 and get some combat damage in, he becomes a 2/2 Menace, which means that he becomes unblocked again. So he can get a fair bit of damage in before your opponent can do anything about it. Either that or they blow some removal on it, and either way, you're pretty fine. Next we've got Bomat Courier. So for 1 colourless, we get a 1/1 with haste. Yet again, we're trying to get in as early as possible to get some of that aggression in. However, when Bomat Courier attacks, you get to exile the top card of your library face down. We cannot look at it. So we can pay 1 and discard our entire hand, sacrifice Bomat Courier, and then put all of the cards we exiled with Bomat Courier into our hand. So this deck will run out of cards fairly quickly. It is quite hyper aggressive. So we expect that we're going to lose a lot of our cards in our hand. So if we get Bomat Courier down very soon, in about 4 or 5 different attacks, he'll have about 4 or 5 different cards underneath him. So when we get empty-handed, we just simply pay 1, sacrifice our courier, we lose our 1/1, but we get like 5 cards or whatever it is. So if our hand is also quite bad, we might want to throw it away early as well to do that sort of thing. So Bomat Courier is really cool because it allows you to refill your hand, something that aggressive decks can't do very well. So that's what this one helps with. We've then got 4 copies of Fiery Impulse, so for 1 red we get an instant speed. Fiery Impulse deals 2 damage to target creature. However, if you have Spell Mastery online, which is essentially if you have 2 or more instants and sorceries, which is quite likely, then Fiery Impulse actually does 3 damage to that creature instead. So later on in the game we can deal 3 damage to a creature, but for the most part this is here to get some of the early game blockers from our opponent out of the way and get some more damage in. We want to push through as much damage as soon as possible, so Fiery Impulse really early on in the game is really good for that. There is also an argument for Kaladesh, instant speed, red, drop, Harness Lightning. For 2 mana it'll do 3 damage and then you can save some of it, but the 2 mana is really difficult in that sense as well, so we're just going with the Fiery Impulse this time. We then have Titan Strength, so I actually am a little torn between Titan Strength and Built to Smash, which is why it's still in here as a one-off, so it's mostly in the testing phases. But Titan Strength is a 1 mana instant speed, target creature gets +3/+1 until the end of the turn, and you get to scry 1. So the added bonus of Titan Strength is the scry ability, and also that you can do it whenever you want. However, Built to Smash, the option here is that we get +3/+3, which means that it gives a little bit more toughness than the Titan Strength, which only gives +1. However, it's only useful on attacking creatures, which we will be doing a lot, but sometimes we might want to react with a Titan Strength on a prowess creature, for example. And in which case this won't trigger, well, this won't legally target that creature, essentially. So but if it's an artifact, then it gains trample until the end of the turn as well. So we have synergies with our artifacts, like the Bomat Courier. We can make this into a 4/4 trample on turn 2, essentially. We can also, we have Smuggler's Copters in here, so we can make that a 6/6 trample, which gets past a lot of flyers in the format. And then later on as well, we have Fleetwheel Cruiser, which is already trampling, but, you know, still get +3/+3, which isn't anything to turn your nose up at. So that's our pump spells. I'm not entirely decided on whether which one's better over the other one. Maybe you want an even balance, perhaps. This one's sort of a bit of an iffy one. But yes, next we have a 1 mana Expedite. So for instant speed, you get to give a target creature haste until the end of the turn and draw a card. So this is a cantrip. When you cast it, it replaces itself, which is awesome. It also means that we can haste out our Abbot of Kerrol keeps and things like that. So we get a prowess trigger and it comes in as a hasty 3-2, for example. Especially if we get it off the Abbot as well, it's really good for that. So prowess triggers it's really good for, and getting out our non-hasty creatures as well is very useful to us. So that is why we have some expedites. We then have Abbot of Kerrol Keep, as I mentioned. It is a 1 and a red, 2-1 with prowess. When it enters the battlefield, you get to exile the top card of your library, and then until the end of your turn, you may play that card. So, on turn 2, we'll play this guy. If we play him on turn 2, we lose the value of the enter the battlefield trigger. So preferably, if we've got enough pressure on the board anyway, preferably we want to play it on turn 3, because then at least we have potentially 1 mana open, and if Abbot exiles a land off the top, you can play the land from Abbot as well. But for the most part, you want to try and put as much pressure in as possible, so if it seems as though you probably should be playing Abbot, just disregard the exile ability, would be my suggestion for that kind of thing, so you can get in that damage extra early. We are going to get prowess triggers later on in the game, so it's not as if the card that we're missing is going to hurt us too much. We're going to get some extra damage in the earlier he gets out. We then have Kyric Forge Master. 2 mana, 1 and a red, so we get a 2-1. Whenever Kyric Forge Master blocks or becomes blocked by a creature, this creature deals 1 damage to that creature. So 1 toughness creatures cannot block this without dying, essentially. They'll just instantly die before the combat damage takes place. And if you don't cast any spells on that turn, so if we've got empty-handed at this point, or our opponent's done nothing, then we get to transform it into Flameheart Werewolf. So it becomes a 3-2, so it essentially gets +1/+1. And instead of dealing 1 damage to blocking or blocked creatures, it deals 2 damage instead. And if our opponent casts 2 or more spells, or if a player, sorry, casts 2 or more spells that turn, we get to transform it back. So we get a little bit of value out of this being a late game creature, in the sense that we probably have an empty hand and we can't cast many spells, for example. But also in the early game as well, it attacks really well into Thopters and stuff like that. So that's awesome. We then have Ember Hauler, so for 2 red mana we get a 2-2, and it has the ability to pay 1 and sacrifice itself, and Ember Hauler deals 2 damage to target creature or player. So this guy can potentially be a 4 damage burn spell in the sense. If you can get in for the attack with the 2, you can finish them off by sacrificing it and dealing extra 2 damage. It's also, if your opponent's trying to get rid of it, because we're going to put on a lot of pressure, your opponent wants to try and get rid of your creatures because they are hasting in constantly. So if your opponent tries to remove it, we can pay 1 in response to at least get some value out of it for 3 mana, essentially, to deal 2 damage to target creature or player. Probably want to point it at a player, but there are obviously scenarios when you want to put it at a creature. It's also instant speed, the effect as well, so if we do want to point it at a creature, like a vehicle or something like that, we can sacrifice Ember Hauler at instant speed for that kind of thing. We then have 4 Mage Ring Bullies, so for 1 and a red we get a 2-2 prowess creature, and it has to attack each turn if able. This is a downside, but we can turn it kind of into an advantage if we play things like Infectious Bloodlust that make us attack each turn if able. It's doing it anyway, so it means that we're forced to put on the pressure a little bit though. But the attacks each turn if able is a little bit of a downside, so maybe you want to cast it main phase 2 if you're going to give it use Expedite or something like that. But for the most part, this guy can put in a lot of damage. He's probably the all-star of the deck. We then have Smuggler's Copter for 2 mana. 2 mana for a flying 3-3 that when it attacks or blocks, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So a 2 mana 3-3 flyer that can loot is broken on just by itself is really, really awesome. It also has the ability to crew 1, so we can tap any number of creatures with total power 1 or more, and then this becomes an artifact creature. So it dodges sorcery speed removal, that kind of thing. Gets over the top of our opponents, and crewing 1 is essentially any card in our deck can crew it as well. So if we do have a creature with summon sickness and we already have a Smuggler's Copter on the battlefield, we can use that summoning sick creature to crew our Smuggler's Copter and get that little bit of extra damage in. Looting as well is really good for this deck, because if you get flooded, then you want to be discarding your lands to the Smuggler's Copter and getting a little bit deeper in your deck. We then have Infectious Bloodlust, so for 1 and a red, we get an aura. So we enchant creature, that creature gets +2/+1 and haste, and attacks each turn if able. So when the creature dies, you may search your library for a card named Infectious Bloodlust, reveal it and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So for 2 mana, we can give any one of our creatures haste, so the Summoning Sickness goes away. It's also a non-creature spell, so it triggers prowess as well. If we put it on a Majoring Bully, we're essentially just adding to the attacks each turn if able. It's going to do it anyway, so we might as well make it a 4/3 with haste. Which will actually, the turn it comes down, it'll be a 5/4, because non-creature spell will trigger prowess, so the first turn it comes down onto a prowess creature is pretty good. And we have Twin Bolt, so for 1 and a red, instant speed, Twin Bolt deals 2 damage divided as you choose among 1 or 2 target creatures or players. So this can be a 2 damage burn spell to your opponent, 2 damage burn spell to a creature, or you can spread the Twin Bolt to 2 different creatures like Thopter tokens, that kind of thing. Any sort of 1/1 like human token or, you know, anything with 1 toughness, you can blow up the board that way. You want to try manage your board as much as possible. And we intend to win in the early game as well, so the chances are Twin Bolt is going to be useful a lot of the time as well. We then have Spark Mage's Gambit, essentially the same thing as Twin Bolt, except for it is sorcery speed, and we have to point 1 damage at 2 creatures. We can't point both points of damage at a single creature. However, the upside is that those creatures cannot block this turn, so this is a great way for us to push through some extra damage. So it activates a prowess trigger on our Majoring Bully with our Infectious Bloodlust, for example. Your opponent can no longer block that 5/4, or at the very least, we can choose which creature blocks as well. So we can force a non-profitable block if we want, if they've got 3 creatures, for example. We can do that sort of thing. So Spark Mage's Gambit is really good for closing out the end game. If they're going quite wide and they have some big creatures, for example, we can get right past an Ulamog by just pinging it for 1 and stopping it for blocking. Get that last bit of damage in that we need to win. We then have Chandra, Fire of Kaladesh. So for 1 and 2 red, we get a 2/2 legendary creature. Whenever you cast a red spell, you get to untap Chandra. Why do we want to do that? Well, because a second ability essentially makes her into, what are they called now? God damn it, I've forgotten the name. Where are ya? Where are ya? Not there. Not there, what am I doing? I don't know. Oh, I've got Kaladesh set. That'd be why. Eldritch Moon. Thermo Alchemist is the one I was on about. So it's essentially a 3 mana Thermo Alchemist. However, if it deals 3 damage in a turn, you get to exile her and then bring her back as Chandra the Roaring Flame. So if we've managed to do 3 damage for the turn, we then plus her to do 5 damage, which is pretty awesome. She's a 4-lighter Planeswalker anyway. Her +1 ability allows us to do 2 damage to target player. Her -2 allows us to do 2 damage to target creature, which might be all we need to push through that last bit of damage with our creatures, clear the way. And if we manage to get her all the way to her ultimate, her -7 ability, Chandra the Roaring Flame does 6 damage to each opponent, which most of the time is enough to kill them. However, each player dealt damage this way gets an emblem, and at the beginning of their upkeep, it deals 3 damage to them. So a -7 ability is going to do 9 damage, essentially. Which, if you haven't done 9 damage by the time Chandra's flipped, I don't know what you're doing. To be honest, you've probably already lost. But, yeah, she's really good for that sort of thing. She's a fair bit of a little bit of a problem. I'm not entirely sure on her, either. For 3 mana, for a 2/2 that kind of has to take a turn off to lose a Summoning Sickness before she's quite useful. Not entirely convinced. You can't even expedite her because she untaps. Her trigger goes on the stack before she's been given haste, so you can't tap her in response to the expedite, for example, if she had Summoning Sickness. So I'm not sure, but she's been doing work though from the playtesting that I've been doing, so I'm not too fussed about keeping her in there. It's not like she's a bad card by any stretch of the imagination, but yeah, if you're thinking about cutting something, it's possibly that Chandra should come out. So we then have Kozilek's Return. This is our way of wiping the board. So for 2 and a red, instant speed, Kozilek's Return deals 2 damage to each creature. So if our opponent's gone too wide for us to handle with their tokens, like their Thopters for example, we get to wipe the board for 2 damage to each creature. The next part of the card is quite irrelevant because we'll never trigger it. But essentially, if an Eldrazi that's bigger than 7 or greater enters the battlefield under our control, then, or we cast one, then we deal 5 damage to each creature, but that is irrelevant because we don't have the ability to do that. So it's essentially, it's a 3 mana, 2 damage to each creature. It's a debuffed Radiant Flames. Radiant Flames is also sorcery speed, and we could only do it for 1, so that's why Kozilek's returns here. It doesn't come into use very often, but I like to have it around just in case, so that's why it's there. We then have Exquisite Firecraft. This is the best way to close out the game, in my opinion. So for 1 and 2 red, we get a sorcery speed burn spell. Exquisite Firecraft deals 4 damage to target creature or player. So you want to hold this guy off until the very last moment, because with Spell Mastery, if there's 2 or more instants and sorceries in your graveyard, which there always will be, most likely, by the time you want to cast it, Exquisite Firecraft cannot be countered. So if you manage to get your opponent down to 4 life, and they're running control, for example, then you want to use this guy at the last moment so that it's absolutely uncounterable and they can do absolutely nothing about it. So it's really good for that. We then have Akum Firebird. So for 2 and 2 red, we get a 3/3 with flying and haste. Also attacks each turn if able. So it's really good to close out that last little bit of damage. Most people don't run too many flyers in the format. And if it dies anyway, you can pay 6. It's a little bit out of our range. We should probably be already winning by that point. By the point we've got to 6 mana. But if we're flooded, for example, and they've just wiped our board, then we might as well use the landfall trigger. So whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 6. If you do, Akum Firebird returns from your graveyard to the battlefield to attack again. So it can be a surprise attack as well if it comes down to it. We then have Fleetwheel Cruiser. I'm not entirely certain about this card, but I think it's pretty good. So for 4 mana, we get a Trampling Haste 5/3, and when it enters the battlefield, it becomes an artifact creature until the end of the turn. This is mostly why I want to try it out. It seems like a 4 mana Reality Smasher in a nutshell. Crew 2 is a little bit difficult, but I say it's a little bit difficult. It's not even remotely difficult, because all of our creatures have some sort of 2 power. I mean, Bomat Courier is the only one who potentially can never crew the vehicle. So, and for 4 mana, it comes in as a 5/3 that can surprise your opponent that way and get that last little bit of damage in. And then from that point on, it's mostly for the later game. So if we need to get a little bit of trample damage in the late game, we can just crew up one of our creatures who can't get past theirs, for example, and then trample. We might even use Built to Smash at that point, which would give it +3/+3. It would also give it trample, but it has trample anyway, so it doesn't make much of a difference. I'm not certain on this, but it seems to be alright. It seems to fit the deck strategy pretty well, so we'll see. We have Chandra, Torch of Defiance. So for 2 and 2 red, we have a 4 loyalty Planeswalker. So she has 2/+1 abilities. The first one is exile the top card of your library. You may cast that card. If you don't, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So for 4 mana, we can ping our opponent for 2 for +1, get it to 5 loyalty. If we've got mana left over as well, we can cast the card that we get off the top. We have a very low curve. For the most part, if we look at our curve, a lot of 1 and 2 drops, very few 3 and 4 drops. So the chances are, if we get her down later in the game, we're always going to be able to cast this. If we hit a land, you can't cast it, so it just deals 2 damage to each opponent, which is okay. And then, also, if we want to cast some of the other stuff in our hand, her other +1 ability adds 2 mana to our mana pool. So she essentially just costs 2 red if you do the other +1. So we can get her out really cheaply. There was an argument to stop doing that, not play her, because we have run a low curve. But if we really need to get her out for super cheap, as long as we've got 4 mana, we can get her out for 2 mana essentially. And we can cast the rest of the stuff in our hand. Next, she has a -3, so this is the way that she protects herself. So for -3, Chandra, Torch of Defiance deals 4 damage to target creature. This kills a lot of the creatures in the format. Early game, it'll kill Sylvan Advocates, it'll kill a Kalitas just by itself as well, which is really important because Kalitas's lifelink and exile ability is really brutal against us if they can manage to land that kind of thing. But 4 damage is quite high for the toughness levels in our in the format right now, so it's really good for a -3. A -7 ability, which is quite likely to come out, to be honest, so because we're going to be playing a +1 and throwing out loads of blockers and stuff like that and burning our opponent. A -7, which doesn't take too long to get to. You get an emblem with, whenever you cast a spell, this emblem deals 5 damage to target creature or player. So if we can emblem Chandra, then all of our 1-drops officially deal 5 damage, essentially. All of our 2-drops do, all of our 3-drops. Just really brutal at that point. So she's a really good card. I think she fits perfectly into this deck strategy, so that's why she's here. And moving on to the land base, very simple. We have 19 mountains and 1 Looming Spires. Looming Spires enters the battlefield tapped. However, when it enters the battlefield, target creature gains +1/+1 and first strike until the end of the turn. So the mana base is really simple. The Looming Spires is just there for a combat trick. It's really good if we got flooded, if we are flooded as well, because we can just we can hold it in hand to give our creatures first strike. Specifically Mage Ring Bully. If our opponent's holding back creatures to try and kill our Mage Ring, we give it first strike. Maybe give it a few prowess triggers, and then we're really not letting our opponent get any sort of value out of it. But we are trying to get off as soon as possible and finish off our opponent as early as possible, and that is why it's only a one-off, because you don't want to hit tap lands right at the beginning of the game. It's just really bad for you, so that's why it's only a one-off. Anyway, guys, that's going to be the deck. Stay for the end card for match number 1. There will be a link to it. Be sure to leave a like if you like the look of the deck, and subscribe if you haven't already for more Magic content in the future. If you're not sure about subscribing, then stay for the end card, see the rest of the content I got to offer, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.